All right, waxing fanatics, this is the new, as of fall of 23, product from MountainFlow. They kind of set their name up with creating plant-based waxes, a little more environmentally friendly. But now they've come up with an infrared waxer, and I should say handheld infrared waxer, because infrared waxing was developed in the early 2000s by Christian Bolt in Switzerland. And there have been infrared waxing machines made that are in ski shops. And those ones have a track, and then the elements are on an arm, and then you have your skis or board laid out here. And in that case, you can do both skis at the same time, and the elements move back and forth, and they radiate onto the base. And so if you're not familiar with what infrared waxing does, you take these lights, these elements, and you shine it on the base, and that changes the energy from the infrared light or waves absorbed by the base, and then that warms the base up, and that energy is released as heat back out of the base. And that is when you take your wax block, and once it's warm, you just rub it on, and it melts right off the block and goes onto and eventually into, soaking into the base. So that is the basic concept of it. Ski shops have two distinct advantages over the handheld one that I saw, at least two. One is that it's moving for you. I guess it's a few. It's moving for you. It's inside where it's warm, room temperature. Most of us waxing our skis are doing it out in the garage where it's not heated, and you're subject to at least close to the outside temperature, if not maybe a little bit warmer in your garage. I had some friends come help me test this waxer, and I set up a waxing station out in the backyard. It was early December, like 50s, maybe even low upper 40s, and slight breeze. And that is one of the main differences between the infrared method and an iron method. Is, I think that, so when you're warming up your bases, I would argue that the time it takes for the infrared to warm up the base is comparable to the time it takes the iron to warm up before you can start melting wax and dripping it on there. The advantage for just a single pair of skis is you're doing that kind of at the same time, and you're moving your way down the ski. I found that, I couldn't keep the whole ski warm at once, just like I would in a ski shop scenario. So I had to start at the tip or the tail and then work my way down to the end and do that. If you have a lot of people waxing and you're using an infrared waxer, each person has to warm up their ski or snowboard to then get the wax to melt on there. If you're using an iron, the iron stays hot. You can just hand it off to the next person, and they've already got a hot iron to start dripping wax. So worth talking about is the price difference. So $250 for the infrared waxer versus, I guess, 60 or $70 for a new iron. Cheaper if you buy them used, and then you buy a scraper as well. And then everybody's got to buy wax and probably brushes as well for that process. But that is the main advantage of the infrared waxer, is there's no scraping involved. You do not have to scrape your skis once you've waxed it, because you are only taking the wax that you need from the bar as you rub it on the ski. Whereas when you're dripping wax, you're kind of having a guess. And granted, for many of us over time, over years of waxing, we've probably gotten pretty good at knowing how much wax we need as we drip it on. But just for grins, after waxing a pair of skis, I took a scraper and ran it along the ski. And yes, while some wax did come off, it was so little compared to how much wax would come off if I used a drip method onto the ski. So arguably, eventually you would save money by using the infrared waxer, because you're not going to go through as many bars. Our testing process, along with those friends and, a bunch of other waxing that I did, was about 24 pairs of skis. And then there's how much we used. That's not quite all 24 because I did do some cold wax. This is a universal temperature wax. And now we're rolling into spring, and I did do 1 pair of skis with a warm wax temperature for some spring skiing conditions. So that's that. Now, configuration wise, it's heavier than an iron, so you are looking at a bit more fatigue in holding this and carrying this around. You also have to hover it off of the ski, whereas the iron, you can press against it. That would take some of the weight. And my method was, like I mentioned, I'd warm it up and then move my way down the ski or snowboard. Most waxing irons I've used, the power cord comes out in line with the handle. So aside from being heavier, I would say it's also just a little bit more awkward of a thing to handle and move around, in part because you're dealing with this 90-degree bend of the cable. The other configuration differences I would like to see is they recommend that you turn it off each time you're done using it, so you're not setting it down on like that, because you're going to cook your surface there. They want you to turn it off each time. In that case, I would love to see a little kill switch in the feet so that as soon as I set it down, it turns off. And then I want to resume waxing, I pick it up, it turns back on. Maybe there's a master switch, or just unplugging it is the master switch to avoid that. Another option would be to just put the switch right here, and then I could just, with my thumb, flick it on and off as needed. The other thing is the balance of this unit is such that the reason why I have my power cord hanging up high like that is to take some of the weight off of the unit. And as you can see, even with this much weight taken off, it still has a little bit of a balance issue. And if you set it down wrong or too quickly or something, then you run the risk of it's usually going to be near the edge, undoubtedly, and it will fall and break. Risk of it falling and breaking, as far as like major damage, is low, because yes, ideally you've turned it off and it's off. So it's not hot when it falls, and if it does, all you gotta do is unplug it, and that it cools down very quickly thanks to all the venting that they've cut into here. So now you can also screw up with an iron. So I'm not saying that is entirely the infrared waxing configuration where that risk lies. The other risk worth talking about is damage to the ski base. And again, if you hold an iron on a ski base for too long, you're going to damage it. To test that, and because this is a retired pair of skis, after I'd waxed these and let them cool off completely, I wanted to see how long it took to damage the ski holding the infrared waxer over it. So I kind of took it and I held it over, and about an inch or so, 2 inches off the base, and just held it there and watched it. And it took about 45 seconds before I started seeing wisping coming up. And the process was, it was matte finish because the wax was cold, and then I could see it gloss as the wax warmed up and started melting. And then I could see a little bit of smoke starting to come off as the wax was evaporating. And as it evaporated, I could also see how it started to turn from glossy back to matte again, because now the wax was going away and I was getting back down to the bare base material. But after all that, I realized, and then I should say that, yes, there was some bubbling in the base by the time I had switched everything off. And that was probably 90 seconds, so a minute and a half worth of holding the unit over the ski base there. But I would have to say that it took that very deliberate effort of trying to burn the base and damage the base to get it to damage. And I would argue there's very little concern for damaging your bases if you just are continuing to move up and down and recognizing that as soon as it's warm enough to melt wax, you get your wax on there and you move to a different spot. And if you do it that way, you'll be totally fine. So there you go. That's the delve into that. Curious to hear how you're using it. If you're using one, if you're thinking about getting one, what other questions you have, leave your comments and questions. I'll try to get to those. And if there's other users out there who have them, hopefully you can join and contribute to the conversation as well. So that's it, the infrared IR waxer from MountainFlow.